Hello everybody. Recently I've been working on the idea of audio visualization. This type being more similar to an oscilloscope, kind of like a traditional approach, but also working on these more artistic ones. This one has a radial display of 3 different colors based on the 3 bands of the audio. So the lower bands are more red, the mids are green, and the highs are blue. So whenever I start a project, I like to break it down into its main functions. And in this case, I had 3 main things I needed the code to do. The first one obviously being getting the data from the audio file and converting it from binary into something more readable and then adding it to a big list. Then once I had this big list of data, I needed to map it to a value like a color value or like a pixel position, whatever I kind of wanted the animation to be. And then I would save that as an image. And then once I had all these images, I would join them all together, add the original audio, and then export that as an MP4 video. This isn't like the best way to do this, but it's like the best thing I could come up with at the time. So the first thing I had to do was actually get the data from the audio file. Audio files can kind of be defined by 2 main things, which is the sample rate and the bit depth. So if we plot like an analog sound wave, it'll look something kind of like this, with the time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have the amplitude, which is kind of like the volume. So the bit depth is basically how many different volumes can you have, and this is a binary number. So basically if you have a bit depth of 4, you'll get 32 different possible loudnesses, and if you have a bit depth of 16, you'll get something like 65,536 different possible values that the loudness at any point can be. And if we plot that to the graph, we might get something like this. The sample rate is measured in hertz, and it's how many times per second are you taking measurements of that amplitude. So if you have a really low sample rate like 4, only 4 times a second are we taking measurements of the sound, and you'll get something that's not very accurate and kind of looks jagged and looks like this. But if we take lots of samples, for example, I think in this project I used 88,000 samples a second, you'll get something that very closely reflects the actual analog sound. So if you want to know the total amount of samples we're going to have for this project, we do the sample rate multiplied by how long the audio is. So say we want a 30-second long piece of audio, we do 88,000 times 30, and then that gives us this huge number. So now we'll have a list of values from minus 32,768 to 32,768, and we'll have a list that is that long. So now we have all this audio data, we want to map these values to something. So let's say for this project we want to produce an animation that is a solid color. The video is 30 seconds long at 24 frames a second and a sample rate of 88,000 samples. So if we have 88,000 audio samples a second, but only 24 frames per second for the video, we want a way to map this 88,000 to the 24. So 88,000 divided by what is 24, or if you rearrange that, we get 88,000 divided by 24 equals about 3,666. So every 3,666 samples in the audio, we want that to map to 1 frame. So a good way to do this is just sum them all together and get an average. So the average of the last 3,666 audio samples is the value for the 1 frame sample, if that makes any sense. So now we have this big list of amplitude values, we want to map them to color values. And in this case, we want to map them to RGB color values, with the R being how intense the red is, the G being how intense the green is, and the B being how intense the blue is. And the intensity is from 0 to 255 for each one. So for example, if you had a color with 255 red, 0 green, 0 blue, you'd get like a pure red color. And if you had like a very high green number, you'd get like a green color. And if you had like a mix of red and blue, you'd get like a purplish color. So to actually map these amplitude values to color values, the first thing I wanted to do was get the absolute value of the amplitude, meaning that if it's a negative number, essentially just turns it into a positive number. You might have saw earlier that it went from negative 36,000 to positive 36,000. And that's basically just because it's a sine wave. The reason I wanted to use absolute values instead of kind of a mixture of negative and positive numbers is basically just because it's easier to map. So now all the amplitude values range from 0 to 36,768. And then we just map this using this function to 0 to 255. So if the amplitude is 0, you get a value of 0. If the amplitude is 36,768, it will give a value of 255. If it's somewhere in the middle, it will give like 120 something. So essentially this just converts the amplitude values into like their respective color value. So if we split the original audio we had into 3 different audio files, being the lows, the mids, and the highs, we can repeat all of these steps for each one, with the lows being associated with the red color, the mids being associated with the green color, and the highs being associated with the blue color. And that gives us a full set of RGB values. So now we have this big list of RGB values, we can run through it, and for each color we can create an image, and each of these images will eventually be a single frame in the final video. So now we have all of these images, the final thing we need to do is join them all together into a video. And to do this, the only piece of information we need is how long we want the frame to be. And in this case, as each image is a frame, we just do 1, which is 1 second, divided by the frame rate, so it will give you 1/24, or 24 frames a second. And finally, we can add the audio over the top and export this video as an MP4. So with all the code now finished, and working a good 50% of the time, I thought I'd end by showcasing some examples of the work. I just wanted to say, obviously I don't make any money from these videos and things like that, and they take quite a long time to edit because I'm still new to the whole video making process. So if you could leave any suggestions of ideas you have for different projects, or how you would change this project, it would be super helpful. And if you could, subscribe and like and all of that stuff, it'd be super helpful. So I hope you enjoy.